in some degree to weapons, unless of course you're the mum who's being dragged around by the fanatic husband. I'm going to be talking about wacky weapons, and a spoiler alert here. Although this is Tankfest, I'm only going to be mentioning tanks a couple of times. So if you think I'm going to be talking about the wacky weapons in tank world, you know, things like Hobart's funnies, then I'm not going to be doing that. I'm not going to be talking about the atomic bomb or the bouncing bomb. I'm going to be talking about some weapons which I hope that, even with a fantastically knowledgeable audience like this, there'll be things that you haven't heard of before. But as I say, most of them won't be involving tanks. Here's a wacky weapon. Does anybody recognise this character? If you're not British, you won't stand a chance. But if you are British and you're my sort of age, you might recognise Captain Hurricane there. And he's obviously a fantasy figure from the Valiant comic in the 1960s and the 1970s. And truth is often stranger than fiction, and I'm going to show you some weapons which I think are even stranger than the mythical powers possessed by the Royal Marine Captain Hurricane. So we'll start off with looking at a problem that the infantry have had, and I think this picture from showing the German infantry in urban fighting actually encapsulates the problem that has always existed and exists to this day, which is when you're fighting in an urban terrain, what's around the corner? And what's around the corner is probably an enemy with lots of weapons, and he's trying to kill you, and what you're trying to do is to find out where he is, peeking around the corner if you like, without getting your own headshot off. And so what the Germans are going to do here is the traditional infantry way of doing business, which is don't take a chance, post a grenade around the corner, when the grenade explodes, follow it up with lots of firepower. Here's some Russian soldiers in the same campaign in World War II doing the same sort of thing. Guy there with a flamethrower that you can see, and also the guy in the foreground is clearly peeking around the corner, trying to see what's happened without getting his head shot off. And you'll all recall that famous scene in Saving Private Ryan where Tom Hanks gets a bit of chewing gum and he puts the shaving mirror on the end of the bayonet in order to look around the corner. It's that sort of thing, and that's one solution to the problem. And it goes on to this day. And here's a picture from one of the ways of dealing with this sort of business, and the traditional way, if you like, the army way of doing it, which is put the weapon above the parapet and shoot in the general direction of the enemy. And the chances of hitting anybody like that clearly are almost zero. Here's the way around it, the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, and what the Australians here have done is used a Lee Enfield rifle. They've rigged it up with bits of wood and a mirror system and a way of firing the weapon so that they can stay below the parapet, see where the enemy is. You can see the guy with the trench periscope on the right there, and then fire at the enemy. But we're going to be talking about World War II. So the weapon that we're going to be looking at initially isn't actually this. This is just the bearer for the system I'm going to be describing, and you'll all recognise the Stug 44, the Sturmgewehr 44, the father of all modern assault rifles. And what we're looking at is an attachment that the Germans came up with to solve this particular problem, and it's this thing here, and I'm sure many of you have seen it before, and it's called the Krummlauf, and the Krummlauf is just German for curved barrel. So what the Germans did is they devised a way of bending the barrel by an attachment that fits onto the end of the rifle, and it bends through a certain number of degrees with a mirror sighting system to allow you to not only look around the corner of a building typically, but also to fire accurately at the enemy. And they came up with a number of different variants of this: 30 degrees, which is the most common one, 45 degrees, 60 degrees, and as much as 90-degree bending of the barrel, which I'll show you in just a second. But let's have a look at it in operation. And what we've got here are some shots from British infantry at the end of the war, so after the war is finished, who have got captured German weapons, and they're trying them out there. And you can see that what the guy's doing there is using it in a number of different ways. He doesn't expose himself. It's actually a very accurate weapon system, and a trained shot using this could achieve a 35 centimetre by 35 centimetres, that's about 1 foot by 1 foot, grouping at 100 metres using that system. So it was actually pretty good. And here's the mirror sighting system. It took a little bit of getting used to, but the Germans liked what they did with it, and their view was that every single infantryman should be equipped in the future with a Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle and one of these 30-degree attachments, and they're in the process of doing that when the war finished. but there are problems with it. And here's some American soldiers, and they've got a bit of a bemused expression on their face, and this is the 90-degree version. And one of the reasons why the Germans decided to come up with a 90-degree version was they saw it as a self-defense weapon for tanks. Oh, I mentioned tanks for the first time. And the idea was that you could stick it up through a small hole in the roof armour, and if your tank was being overrun by Russian infantry, you could hose them down using the 90-degree attachment. But there were problems with this, and one of the problems they had was that the barrel, because of the stresses being placed upon the barrel, whenever you fired a round, it basically started to destroy the barrel. And the 30-degree version would only last for around about 300 rounds, 10 magazines, before it was completely destroyed and couldn't be used anymore. And the more you bent the barrel, the worse the problem became. And the other issue was, when you started to bend the round, because of the stresses placed on the round as it travelled down the curving barrel, it tended to shatter. So you ended up with the pieces of metal coming out the end rather than a coherent ball round, which, if the enemy was only 5 metres away, might be advantageous because it would have a shotgun effect. But if the enemy was any distance away, you'd have no effect on him whatsoever. And I think the measure of this particular weapon, it was a clever idea. It was the Germans, like their technology. The measure of it is that no army since 1945, having examined the system, has chosen to take it forward. Okay, let's now move on to the Sea War. And if you know anything about the North Atlantic campaign, you'll be familiar with the terms the air gap or the black hole. And what we've got here is the North Atlantic, the route that all the convoys are taken, and let's say that this is about 1941. And the circles that you can see there denote the limits of air power from patrol aircraft which are flying from bases on the western side of the United Kingdom, from Iceland and from the eastern side of Canada. And you can see that the circles don't quite overlap, and in the middle there is this thing called the air gap, where air cover cannot be provided to look after the convoys. And the Allies knew it, and the Germans knew it, that this was the place where the convoys were most vulnerable. And most of the sinkings that took place of Allied ships, either independently or in convoys, took place within the black hole. So what can we do to fill the void? Well, one of the obvious ways of doing, and I'm sure some of you have already thought of this, is why don't we just use aircraft carriers? And that would have done the job, but there just simply were not enough aircraft carriers to go round. Remember that America, with all its massive resources, did not join the war until the end of 1941. Britain has got very few aircraft carriers, and it needs them in other places, and it cannot afford to come up with an aircraft carrier that will go into the air gap. But a guy called Geoffrey Pike, who was an inventor who was working for the Combined Operations Headquarters. Now, if Geoffrey Pike walked in here today into Tankfest and he walked past you, you'd probably look at him and go, he looks just like a mad inventor. Because that's exactly what Geoffrey Pike was, a mad inventor. Looked like one, acted like one, and what I'm going to show you now is one of his ideas. And this idea gained currency, got the support of both Mountbatten and Churchill for a good couple of years. And this is what he devised. Rather than having a fleet of aircraft carriers, HMS Habakkuk, it's a biblical reference, was going to be the largest warship that had ever been built. And if it had been built, it would have been the largest one even up to this present day. About twice the size of USS Enterprise. 6 football pitches long and a football pitch wide. You can see the dimensions of it. It's an absolutely huge undertaking. And the idea is that if you can have this large but very slow moving aircraft carrier in the middle of the black hole, then the problem goes away because we've got an aircraft carrier permanently on station. But I haven't told you the wacky bit. And the wacky bit is that it was made of ice. So the idea was, there was 2 versions of this, and the first one was that what you could do is take literally go up to the North Pole and take a suitable chunk of ice, an iceberg, and work on it and turn it into an aircraft carrier with a steel runway. The other thing that you could do, and this was Pike's particular sort of great invention, was rather than using just ice, you could use a material called pikecrete, something he devised, which was a mixture of ice and wood pulp. And he sold it to Churchill and Mountbatten on the basis that the energy required to make this out of ice, or indeed Pykrete was about 1% of if you were doing the equivalent thing with steel. So it seemed in the middle of the war to be a very interesting and economical thing to do. Now, some of you are probably looking at that and going, well, that's a great idea, but there seems to be a few problems with that, and I'm sure that I would agree with you, because one of the problems, of course, is, hey, it's made of ice. How on earth are you going to get people to live and work and service aircraft and refuel aircraft and all the rest of it inside a big block of ice? And although Churchill and Mountbatten gave it their support, luckily some scale trials were carried out on Lake Patricia, which is in Canada, and they actually proved that the idea, once you started to put it into the right scale, could not possibly work, and it was quietly abandoned. And if you ever go to Lake Patricia, the remnants of the trial model apparently are still available. So I think you'll agree that is a pretty wacky idea, an aircraft carrier made of ice. Okay, next one then. You probably remember this from early last year, 2023, January, February. The Americans started reporting that they were finding what they took to be surveillance balloons coming from China, which were going across the continental United States. And I'm sure, as I say, most of you will remember that. And the reason it was working is the balloons, which the Chinese, of course, claimed to be meteorological balloons which had gone off course, we're going across on the Gulf Stream, going across the Pacific, and the Gulf Stream takes that route you can see there across the continental United States, and therefore they will naturally, because they're, balloons are unpowered and uncontrolled and unsteered, they will be taken in the right direction across the USA. But this wasn't an original idea, because during the Second World War, the Japanese had done exactly the same thing, and they produced this thing called the Fugo balloon. And because Japanese, as the war went on, were increasingly finding problems with resources, they used a traditional Japanese craft, which is paper making, which they use, of course, for all sorts of things, including building houses, to build these huge balloons. And you can see the scale of it compared to the size of the guy who stood next to it there on the left. And the idea was you create, at very, very low cost, low expense, low resources, something which could transport an explosive device using the Gulf Stream, could be released from Japan, go across the Pacific, and would then be able to fly across the continental United States. And because it's got an explosive device attached to it, at some point it'll make landfall and explode and kill the damned Yankees. And so this started to happen from 1944 into the start of 1945, and during the war about 1,000 of these balloons made landfall in the continental United States. And it's probably quite difficult to see on this black and white drawing there, but if you look closely, if you look into the northwest corner of the United States, around Oregon, Washington, places like that, you can see that that's where the majority of these balloons did come to rest, but some of them actually went a lot further and a lot further south as well, which is just wherever the Gulf Stream took them. And the Americans assessed that about 1,000 of these landed, but we now know from Japanese records that actually 9,000 of them were released at some point during the war. And for all this effort, 9,000 balloons released, 1,000 making landfall in the United States, there was only one incident where casualties were caused by one of these, and it was a very unfortunate incident. It's marked in red on the map you can see there, and it's a place called Bly, which is in Oregon State. And unfortunately, a pregnant woman who was looking after 5 children saw the balloon, and of course, not surprisingly, they didn't know what it was and went up to it. And when they went up to it, it exploded and killed all of them. But for all that effort, 9,000 balloons released, 6 American casualties. And they were all civilians. And you have to ask yourself, if every single one of those 9,000 balloons had reached the United States and exploded next to ordnance factories and ammunition dumps and things like that, would it have changed the course of the war? No, it could not. But it is widely regarded to be the first intercontinental weapon of any kind. Okay, let's go back to the sea. And in 1909, a Royal Navy officer realised that the new technology that was being developed, which was torpedoes, could potentially be used by being manned by divers, another new technology, to steer the torpedo. So it was a Royal Navy idea, and it was picked up with really by the Italian Navy during the First World War. They experimented with it, and at the very end, literally in the last few days of the First World War, the Italians, using one of these manned torpedoes, managed to sink an Austro-Hungarian battleship, which gave them the indication that if there was a future conflict, it could be a good bit of kit. Now, I will stress that what we're talking about here in a manned torpedo, it's not a suicide weapon. So we're not talking about kamikaze attacks, we'll come to those in a second. But at this stage, what we're doing is using the propulsive power of a torpedo, steered and controlled by a couple of divers, to get close to warships underwater and then attach limpet mines to them and things like that. And that's the whole idea. So back to the Italians, they'd had their success in World War I, and here we are in World War II, and these are two Italian operators underwater going through a torpedo net, and the Italians called their particular system maiali, and I don't speak Italian, but apparently that is the Italian word for pig, because it was such a pig to steer. It was a really, really difficult thing to steer underwater, but it had its successes. And in 1941, Italian operators managed to get into Alexandria harbour and nearly sink, but certainly really badly damage the battleships HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant in Alexandria harbour. And so because of this success, the British picked up on this, and they came up with their version of it, which they called the Chariot. It was used in the Far East as well as in more temperate waters, and probably I think the most important use of the Chariot by the Royal Navy, because they also of course had midget submarines, was to put people into the area of the Normandy beaches before the Normandy invasion that Sticky was talking about earlier on, to look at the type of seabed, gradients on the seabed, currents, tides, that sort of thing. So that's the British version of the Chariot. The Germans also had their version, the Naja, which was even worse than the pig. It was really, really dangerous to steer. It often went out of control, and they had probably more people killed during training and testing accidents than anything else. It wasn't really, really that effective. But let's go to the Japanese. I mentioned kamikaze earlier on, and here's the, this is actually a USS ship here. This is the USS Mississinawa, and that has just been sunk by a kamikaze torpedo. So we've gone from being manned torpedoes delivering limpet mines to the Japanese view of it, which is we will use it as a kamikaze weapon. And effectively all the Japanese did was take a Type 93 torpedo, sit an operator on top of it, sealed into the top, so once he was sealed in he couldn't get out, and then he was released close to a warship or a merchant ship and drove it to his death and hopefully the destruction of the warship. And that was the Japanese view. And I'll come back to more kamikaze later on. Okay, let's stay at sea. Let's switch to the U-boat campaign, something I'm particularly interested in, its effects on economic warfare. So here's a typical U-boat, a Type 7 U-boat in a heavy sea, but you'll notice that the conning tower of a U-boat is not very tall. It only stands about 12 or 15 feet above the surface of the sea. And what that means is, because you, as the crew members, you haven't got much elevation, even on a good day, you can only see a horizon which is about 5 nautical miles away. And the Germans put a lot of thought and effort into how can we increase the elevation and therefore increase the range of our observation. And they thought about seaplanes, but they came up with the idea of this. This is the Bachstelze, which is the German for the wagtail bird. And it's an unpowered gyrocopter. And the whole idea is something that is small and fairly simple in technology that can be carried on a U-boat and used when necessary. So let's have a look at some film of it in operation. And here are the crew. And they can take the bits out of its special storage locker, they can put it together, and it will take about 3 to 4 minutes with a well-trained crew. Obviously you can't do this in a heavy sea, to put things together. I just love the fact that they bothered to put the German crosses on it just to identify who it belonged to. It's being towed by a U-boat. So there they are putting it together. The crew member is just a U-boat member who's been trained to be the observer and the pilot. He's probably saying to those guys, make sure you bolt the rotors on. But it's the forward motion of the U-boat, which can do about 17 or 18 knots, which creates enough speed to turn the rotors and give it lift, and therefore it lifts up into the sky, and it's on the end of a 120-metre cable. and by the time it's up at full altitude, it will extend the range of the U-boat's observation to about 25 nautical miles, so about 5 times what they could otherwise see. And then you can reel it back in, and you can break it down, and it takes about the same amount of time to break it down and put it away, 4 minutes, as it did to put it up in the first place. So that's a really, really clever idea. Really, really low technology. It hasn't got an engine or anything like that. There's some problems with this, of course, and one of the problems is, what do you do if you're up there as the pilot observer and suddenly an allied ship or aircraft comes into view? Well, the agreement that the U-boat crews have, of course, is the U-boat's more important than the bloke in the Backstelzer. So cut the cable, and he then just floats down to the surface of the sea. They do an emergency crash dive, and if at all possible, they'll try to come back to the same point to pick him up at some point indeterminate in the future. So it's, I think you're a pretty brave guy to do this. It's a really clever idea, but it actually only led to one sinking of a merchant ship during the whole of the war. It couldn't be used by the Germans in the North Atlantic, partly because of the weather conditions, but also partly because of the increase in air cover that the Allies were able to generate. And therefore, the only place it could really be used was in the South Atlantic, and particularly in the Indian Ocean. And in 1943, U-117 managed to sink a very small Greek freighter as a result of using their Backstelzer. But that was all the effort that went into that one sinking. You see, there's a theme developing here, resources being used and technology being developed, and actually it's going down a blind alley, effectively. Okay, let's talk about guns. So here's a gun that we'll talk about, and I'm sure some of you have seen this before, the FP45 Liberator, also known as the Woolworth pistol. And this isn't a weapon designed to be a military weapon, it's a weapon designed to be used by resistance organisations. The FP, it's given the designation flare pistol as a code cover, and 45 because it uses the standard 45 ACP American ammunition. And the idea is, if we're going to arm the resistance organisations within Europe, what we tend to do is to put bombers over Europe, drop parachute canisters out which have got arms and ammunitions and Sten guns and all this sort of stuff in there, and that's obviously quite a lot of resources. The aircraft can get shot down and all the rest of it. What if we develop a very small, almost single-shot weapon? So the idea is, let's take the French resistance. The French resistance guy can have this weapon in his pocket. It's easily concealed. It's very, very small. Walks up to a lone German sentry at night, shoots him, takes his weapon and his ammunition, and therefore he's now properly armed with a rifle and all the rest of it. And that's the idea behind this. It was called the Woolworths pistol because it was really, really cheap to make. Famously, the Sten was cheap to make. This actually cost only $2.10 to make each unit, and it only comprised 23 parts, and they're all stamped and turned metal that can be made in any small workshop with a lathe and some pressing facilities. So dead easy to make in huge numbers. You can see the skeleton picture there, and it actually has got 5 rounds of 45 ammunition included in the butt, in the handle. It's not a magazine as you would recognise it. So let's have a look at it being used, and this is a fairly recent image of it being used. So here's one of them being used by an American gun expert. You can see he's taken out his round of 45 ACP, and very simply he can open it up, put the round in, cock it and prepare it ready for firing. It's now prepared, ready to go. You can see how short the barrel is. He's fired it. One of the problems you got with it is the case doesn't eject automatically, so you have to carry a stick or a rod or something like that in order to knock the case out. So if you miss with the first round, then it's going to be a bit of a laborious process before you can put the second round in and fire your second shot. Now, these were used and these were issued. The biggest problem with them really was, you've seen how short the barrel is. Well, if you've got a short barrel, most of you will know that the shorter the barrel, the less accurate the weapon will be and the less range you get. And officially, you're meant to be able to shoot this out to a range of about 20 feet. But in actual fact, after the war had finished, more trials were developed on it, and it found that any range greater than 7 feet, which is probably about me to the box, you'd be unlikely to hit your target, even a man-sized target, because the round would go out and it could go just about anywhere. So it was really, really, really inaccurate. But, as I say, unlike some of these weapons here, it was used. Okay, question time for you. If anybody can recognise this, I'll be really, really impressed. Okay, this is the anthrax bacillus. So we're talking now in the realms of bacteriological warfare. And this is the thing that called Operation Vegetarian, funnily enough. Now, famously, of course, chemical weapons, gas was used in the First World War, and everybody expected it to be used again in the Second World War. Luckily, it wasn't. But this is actually, although it's an idea for a bacterial weapon, a bacteriological weapon, this is actually not the fiendish Germans or the Japanese, this is actually a British idea. And again, this is another one of the ideas that when it was presented to the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he actually supported this and liked the idea of it. And he actually gave it as more momentum to this project than from anywhere else. And the Chiefs of Staff were absolutely against this, but it did progress to some degree. And the idea was, you take anthrax, which is a disease of sheep and particularly cows, did I say sheeps? Sheep and cows, and it affects them. And what you do is you make these cakes, basically linseed oil cakes, about 2.5 inches across, round cakes, and you drop them all over Germany. You literally scatter them widespread all over Germany, no aiming required, over the agricultural areas, and the cattle will come up and they will eat the linseed cakes and they will then develop anthrax. And through the meat supply that's going into the human population, the German population, civilian population primarily, will all get anthrax and they'll die in their millions and all the cows will be wiped out. And of course it's bacteriological warfare. But Churchill was really keen on doing this, and it took a lot of effort from, as I say, the Chiefs of Staff and other people to say, no, don't do this. But they did actually develop it. They used soap and biscuit manufacturers who were involved in the production, and they produced over 5 million of these anthrax cakes. And the idea was to drop them over Germany, as I say, and you can see a picture there of the method of distribution. All they were going to do was to use the flare chute, which every RAF bomber had as part of its standard equipment, and literally just shovel them out all over Germany. Luckily, of course, they weren't used, because if they had been used, then it might have well led to widespread use of chemical weapons in retaliation. And at the end of the war, the 5.25 million or so cakes that had been produced were all destroyed in incinerators. But, you know, I'm really, really pleased we didn't do that. Okay, on a similar thing, does anybody recognise that piece of machinery? If you do, you'll recognise it as a printing press, and this is a German operation called Operation Bernhard. And the idea was that the Germans would forge British currency, and this is going back to 1940. And if you can forge enough convincing British currency and introduce it into the British monetary system, then you destroy the economy, because Britain, of course, in World War II is still operating as a capitalist economy. And the idea was to produce as much as potentially £300 million worth of convincingly forged paper money that you could then introduce and wreck the British economy, because nobody would know whether the money they were using was real or forged. And the Germans got this right. They put a lot of effort into it. They used some experts from amongst the inmates of concentration camps, sent them to Sachsenhausen, where they were formed into a specialist SS unit, and they did all the clever work, if you like. And there were two main things that they had to get right. First of all was the fiver that you can see there, the big white fiver, was made of a thing called rag paper. So you have to get the paper right, so it looks very, very convincing. And the other one is, if you look at the serial numbers that are written all over the banknote, there's an algorithm which generates those serial numbers, and it had to be able to replicate what the British were doing. There was no point in doing £300 million worth of £5 notes that all had the same serial number, because they'd be too easy to identify. So they got this sorted out, they worked out the algorithm, and they produced a near perfect, near identical version of the £5 note. They didn't introduce it as they originally planned as a method of waging economic warfare, but they did use it to give funds to some of their always hugely and horribly unsuccessful agents that they dropped into Britain during the war, which almost always were picked up almost straight away. But they produced an awful lot of this money. At the end of the war, with victory, the Allies came upon the operation and realised what was happening, and almost all of the money that had been produced by the SS was dumped into 2 lakes in southern Germany in order to destroy them. But a certain amount of the money remained and it was then introduced into circulation. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I can only speculate that the probably British and American soldiers who were involved in the operation took the opportunity to put a fistful of fivers in their pockets. But quite a lot of it did eventually, after the war, enter into the British monetary circulation system, enough to have the effect that the Germans wanted to produce in 1940, and as a result, the Royal Mint had to change the design of the banknotes because of that. So it only happened after the war. Okay, I'll talk very briefly about boots, and if there's anybody here who's been in the British Army, this is definitely Wacky, then you would recognise the soles of a pair of ammunition boots, but you wouldn't recognise them looking like that, you'd recognise them looking like that. And if you look at the differences, of course, is the number of hobnails. So I'm in the sphere of economic warfare here. So if you look at the left-hand pair of boots, and if you want to bother counting up, you'll see that there are about 25 hobnails on the front of each boot, so therefore 50 for the pair. And if you look at the ones on the right, you'll see that there's only 13 on the sole of each boot. And in 1942, some bright spark realised that Britain was producing such an enormous quantity of boots, around about 8 million pairs of ammunition boots in World War II in Britain alone, let alone in Egypt, India, Canada, places like that, that maybe you didn't need that number of hobnails in order to save the sole of the boot. And if we could reduce the number of hobnails down, we could save an awful lot of metal. And that's what they did, and they worked out this pattern, and the pattern that you can see on the sole of the boot, if you ever watch Trooping of the Colour and you see a guardsman, crash over and faint, have a look at the soles of his boots, because he will be using the pattern that you can see on the right-hand slide. We still use exactly the same pattern for our braid boots to this very day. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because when you multiply the number of nails saved up with the number of boots produced, you come up with a figure of nearly 1 billion nails being saved over the next 3 years. And that is an enormous amount of metal when you're fighting a war of resources. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Luftwaffe and German aircraft development. They went into the war with some aircraft which looked very similar to aircraft which you might have seen at the end of the First World War. So this is a Henschel 123, a ground attack aircraft in 1939. Had the war progressed, the Luftwaffe might have been flying something as futuristic as this. But the Luftwaffe were a huge drain on the technological and industrial resources of Germany, particularly in the idea of projects which they were thinking about and put some work into, but didn't really work. Now, one of the ones which actually did work, but luckily was only deployed in very small numbers at the end of the war, was this. It's the Dornier 335, the File, or the Arrow. And if you look at it closely, you'll see it's got an engine at the front, but it's also got an engine at the rear. Now, if you want to make an aircraft go faster, you normally put an engine on each wing, make it a double engine thing, but then you end up with extra problems of drag. So the Germans realised that if you put the second engine within the rear end of the fuselage, then you largely take away the problems of drag, but you get all the extra power generated by the second engine. And it worked really well. So we often think of the P-51D Mustang as the fastest fighter aircraft of the Second World War, and indeed it was. Actually, although only a few of these deployed, this could actually take the record, because this could do about 35 or 40 miles per hour faster than the Mustang. Luckily, it didn't get developed. But when we're talking about the Luftwaffe in 1944-45, it's jet technology we're often talking about. You'll all recognise the Me-262, and the story of that is well known. It's not particularly wacky, but the Messerschmitt 163, the Comet, this isn't jet technology. This is a very, very small aircraft designed to be a bomber interceptor and nothing more, designed to be very simple to fly. It almost flies on glider principles, and it doesn't use a jet engine so much as a rocket engine. Now, it's a really good idea. I mean, it's got an amazing acceleration up to altitude. It can get up to 20,000 feet to intercept bombers in about 3 minutes flat, which is still a really, really good speed. But it's got its problems. One of the problems is, in order to operate and move quickly across the sky, it's got two different types of fuel. It's got a thing called T-Stoff, Stoff is just the German word for material, T-Stoff which provides the rocket, and then to give it an extra boost, you inject a different material called C-Stoff into the rocket effluent, which gives it a bit of a sort of turbocharged boost to make it go even faster. And the problem with the two materials is you had to keep them entirely separate. If they mixed even in the minutest quantities, the result will be a fireball and a huge explosion, loss of aircraft and pilot. And of course, when you're developing a combat aircraft, being able to do that is very, very difficult. And the Germans found that they had a lot of slightly damaged aircraft that when they landed, on the moment of impact, the C and the T stops would mix and they'd end up losing the pilot and the aircraft, even though in other ways, any other aircraft, it would have been a survivable accident. And the other thing is, it could only fly for 7 minutes, so it could only add 7 minutes worth of propulsion, because as you can see, it's very, very small, and therefore it can't carry much fuel. And then we end up with the Henschel 162. Now you've heard of the Volkswagen, the people's car. Well, this is the Volksjäger, the people's fighter. And again, it's designed to be very, very simple to fly by inexperienced pilots. You can see that it is a jet aircraft because it's got the jet engine mounted on the top of the fuselage there. This can only operate for about 20 minutes because it's small, it can't carry much fuel. Famously, the Mosquito is the wooden wonder. Well, this is mostly made of wood. Obviously the engine isn't, but the wings and the majority of the fuselage and the tailplane are made of wood. One of the things that the Germans found with this was that if you needed to get out of a damaged aircraft, then as you try to escape by parachute, you get sucked into the engine. So they developed the world's first ever operational ejector seat as a result of that. So well done there. But the one I want to show you is this, and this is a German concept. It never flew. The Triebflügel, the ramjet thrust wing hunter, as it's sometimes called. And as I say, this is just a German concept of an idea to fulfill a particular issue and solve a particular problem that they never got through to flying. So what I'm going to show you are post-war reconstructions of what it may have looked like. But the idea is, when you're trying to combat the Allied bomber offensive increasingly in 1944, you've got to fly from airfields and runways. And the Allies know where the airfields and the runways are. So what they'll do is they'll send fighter sweeps over to brass up the runways, bomb the runways, all the rest of it, and put them out of action. So a lack of airfields and runways was getting to be a real problem for the Luftwaffe. So somebody came up with the idea of, what happens if we can come up with what today we would call a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft? Great idea. So in a bomb city, for this to work, you would have only had to have needed a cleared area, which is probably no larger than the area you're sat in front of the stage. It's very, very small, half the size of a football pitch. And so what we've got here is the pilot is sat at the top of the aircraft, the undercarriage is at the back, and then you've got these three wings. They look like wings. And when they get taken off, they'll act like a helicopter and they'll act like rotors. And when they're in level flight, they will act like like the wings and also as the propeller. So let's have a look at somebody's imagery of what it looks like. So there's the wing spinning. Obviously the bearing technology required to make this work is exceedingly difficult. Spinning at about 220 revs per minute, giving it lift, and then when it gets up to altitude it goes into level flight, and therefore the rotors now become the propeller stroke the wings. Really clever idea, I'm sure you'll agree. The difficulty comes, of course, when it's finished its mission and it wants to come back down. So it redeploys its undercarriage, there it goes there, and what the pilot is now effectively trying to do, remember he's sat at the top, the nose of the aircraft, looking up into the sky, and what he's trying to do is to reverse the aircraft. It's a thing that no woman could ever do and most blokes would struggle with. But, you know, if you've ever seen Thunderbirds, Thunderbird 3 could do this perfectly. I was watching it the other day just to prove it to myself. Thunderbird 3 used to take off in the same way and then come down and land within a sort of donut shape. No, you just can't do it. The difficulties of landing this aircraft would have proved to be, I think, impossible. And again, the measure of whether or not this is a good idea and worth all the effort put into it is, has any nation ever designed an aircraft since 1945 using that principle? No, we found other ways of doing vertical and short takeoff landing. You know, typically the Harrier would be in the most famous example. Okay, I've got to talk about tanks, haven't I? So very, very briefly, the Tiger tank, 56 tons. The Tiger II tank creeping up to 70 tons, the size and weight of a modern main battle tank. Let's not forget the German Maus, which probably weighed in, or would have weighed in if it had been completed, at around about 188 tons. 128mm gun with a 75mm gun as its coaxial. The Germans just had this weird thing about bigger and bigger and bigger is better. And the idea was to make an invulnerable tank that was so powerful, all things would be swept beyond it. And in some ways, they get a point, very, very heavily protected, very, very well armed. But then you come down to the practicalities of look at the size of it. It can't cross a bridge. There is no bridge in the world that could take a tank doing that sort of stuff. And for every Maus that you produced, wouldn't you have been better off producing a dozen late model Panzer IVs or Panthers or something like that? So, crazy old thing. And just to give you again an indication of scale, there it is up against the T-34-85. Absolutely immense. I had to mention tanks. Okay, I'm not going to talk about V1s and V2s specifically, but I do want to talk about the potential of the use of the V1 as a suicide weapon. And when the V1 was first being trialled by the Luftwaffe, there were some manned flights. And after it was being used as the world's first ever cruise missile, some people in the German hierarchy, apparently, difficult to get to the bottom of this, as always with Hitler, but said, could we use this as a suicide weapon if we had to, because the war's going badly? And apparently, and I can't prove this to you, Hitler agreed, but the surviving documentation is not really there. It's based on hearsay more than anything else. And here we can see a manned version of the V1 that it might have been had they used kamikaze attacks. And funnily enough, the best picture I could get of it, you can see a Backstelzer sat on the front of it. So, we're talking about kamikaze. We'll finish off by looking at some footage of the American Pacific Fleet and the problems that they were having with kamikaze attacks by Japanese aircraft in 1944 and 1945. Things to pick up from this is you can see the amount of anti-aircraft artillery that's being chucked up into the sky. It's still difficult to knock out some of these aircraft. For the Japanese, the problem really was that kamikaze was a waste in effort. In other words, every time a kamikaze mission took off, it didn't come back, you'd lose the pilot and you'd lose another aircraft, and they could ill afford to do that. So they were looking at ways of having the same effect, but not having the same effect on the aircraft that they were using. And they came up with the idea of this, and it looks a little bit like the manned version of the V1 I showed you a second ago. And it's the Oka, which is the Japanese for cherry blossom. The Germans, when they, beg your pardon, the Americans, when they encountered it, called it a Barker bomb. And a Barker apparently is the Japanese word for idiocy or for being stupid. And it's a rocket-propelled wooden plane, largely wooden, so it's got 3 rockets in the back, the pilot in the middle, very, very simple and easy to fly, and the front of it is all warhead, 2,600 pounds of high explosive, over a ton of high explosive, much more than most kamikaze weapons could carry. And it will be taken into action, strapped on the underside of a Betty bomber, a Mitsubishi Betty, and when it was at the right range, it would be released. It would then glide towards its target, and when it was closer, it would fire up its 3 rockets, and this would propel it towards the American ship at up to 620 miles per hour. So you've got a tiny, tiny target coming at you very, very fast. And it was a clever idea, because if it was going to be used, it probably would have overwhelmed the anti-aircraft defences that you saw earlier on. Luckily, it wasn't used in any great numbers. You're welcome. Wasn't used in any great numbers, but the Japanese were working on better versions of these, and if it had been used in large numbers, it could have had a massive effect on the outcome of the war in the Pacific. Okay, the last one. Some of you will recognise this thing about non-lethal weapons. It's terminology that's been around for the last 20 or 30 years or so, which is the idea of, if you don't have to kill your enemy, you don't. Why don't you just incapacitate him? So we'll talk about Operation Who Me. And in 1943, an American research chemist who was working on chemical weapon defense called Ernest Crocker was taken off and given a secret assignment. And the assignment he was given was to develop what I can only describe as a military-grade stink bomb. And the idea is this, that in order to lower the morale of the German troops on the continent of Europe, without killing them and without all the reprisals that entails. What happens if we could manage to put some sort of substance on the Germans that was just so hideously stinking that it would lower the morale of all the Germans, so therefore it had to be persistent. So Crocker was given the job, and there were two things he had to get right, and the first thing he solved fairly quickly, which was experimentation into what was the worst possible odour that he could come up with. And in the end, the recipe that they came up with, which apparently was utterly indescribably foul, was a mixture of the following ingredients: rancid butter, rotten eggs, and from the human body, a mixture of vomit, urine, excrement, and foot odour. And apparently those 6 things in the right recipe were utterly foul, and the workers were working on this in great secrecy in the laboratory. If they got any of it on their skin, they had exactly the effect that everyone else would avoid them, couldn't go anywhere near them, and it lingered and lasted for days. The problems that the Americans had was the problem that you can see up on the screen, which was, this is the days before aerosols, which is probably what we do now, but how do you actually encapsulate it in such a way that you can keep it in the container and only then get it onto the German without getting it on yourself, because that would be a bit of a giveaway as to who did it in the first place. But it was developed. They finally solved the containment problem with the thing that you can see there, but it wasn't actually deployed. But I'm sure you'd agree that it was wacky. Now, I've come to the end of my time. The next talk will start in 15 minutes, so if you'll indulge me on this, if you've got any questions, I'll come down off the stage in just a couple of minutes' time, wrestle me to the ground, thrust an ice cream in my hand, and let's talk about other wacky weapons that you want to talk about. But I will be back on again at 15:15 with the next lecture, which will be Lance Geiger, the history guy. Thank you.